Welcome to Beyond the Loss. This is a space for parents who have lost a child in any way, at any age, where no grief is ranked, explained, or excluded. I'm Dr. Sharon Spano, developmental coach, systems thinker, and a parent whose life was forever changed by the death of my own son, Michael. What happens when the child who never got to live his life continues to shape yours? What if loss doesn't diminish your life, but continues to inform it over time, giving you a lens for what truly matters? These are the words of today's guest, Dr. Tom Dutta. In this conversation, we'll explore the loss of his son, Tommy, and how grief, identity, and meaning can continue unfolding across a lifetime. Today, we'll talk about loss across generations, the ways identity quietly unfolds over time, and the possibility that what first feels like an interruption can become a formative part of who we are. My guest, Dr. Tom Dutta, is an executive leader, educator, author, and host of The Quiet Warrior Show. His work explores identity, leadership, and what it means to live with greater awareness and purpose. But beyond and behind the professional accomplishments is a father whose son died in the later stages of pregnancy, an experience that continues to shape his life and understanding of what matters most. Good morning, Tom, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, we've talked a little bit about this in our earlier conversations, but before we begin today, I want to dedicate this conversation to the memory of your son, Tommy. And again, thank you for your willingness to be on the show. I know this is a very vulnerable topic for you, for any parent. And I know that your work, as I said in the intro, your PhD work is around identity. But before we get into identity, because that's a major part of the conversation, I think, when you've lost a child, and we look at meaning or the way that Tommy's life continues to shape your family, I'd love for listeners to know a little bit about him. What would you want people to understand about your son, Tommy?
Well, first of all, he's got a great name.
Yeah.
When I grew up as a kid, my mother's still alive. She's 90, and when I did something wrong, I was called Tommy. My legal name's Thomas, but I'm just having some fun with you with that. It's interesting because he passed away preterm, and so what he is with me in my mind is really it's a construct of what I felt with him up until almost the date where he was expected. So as we know from a lot of parents I've talked to, that you start doing things in the pregnancy, right? You start reading to the child, you start rubbing mommy's tummy, and you start living as if you have a son. So he to me is me. He would have been my only son, and he would have been embodied my character, my personality, which is, I believe, intimacy and caring about other people. I think if he were here today, he would be somebody who was fun, had a great spirit, which comes from my wife. And so I guess I'll close this answer with this, that Tommy lives in my imagination as one of the greatest people that would have been here in our life.
And I think, we'll talk more about this as we get into the conversation, but I feel like sometimes it's a really misunderstood experience of loss when the child is lost, perinatal and whatnot. But I'm wondering, what was the future that you and your family had imagined for him? I mean, you've kind of talked a little bit about maybe his character, his spirit. How old would he have been now?
Oh gosh, well, let me just go back in my mind. I'm thinking about how old I am. So he would have been about 30 years old.
Okay.
Right, as of now. And if I can maybe just also tell you the experience we had during those moments when we lost him. I can do that to build on
Sure.
what about today. He was diagnosed with widespread Down syndrome. And I never forget it because I was about 31 years old. And I was a bank manager in one of our largest Canadian banks. And my wife worked for the same bank. That's where I met her. I love her dearly. We've been married 30 years. Her name's Anna. And I got a call at my office from the Children's Hospital. and she got a call, and we both were in two different cars driving towards this children's hospital. And I knew that something was up because you never get a call from Children's Hospital. And we were very close to delivering Tommy. And I remember sitting in that room, and they went through what was wrong and how he more than likely wasn't going to survive the delivery and all of that. And it was like a gut punch. And I just remember back then that the watching my wife go through the grieving, and I felt at that time I had to be the rock. I had to be tough. So
Sure.
I buried everything. So coming forward now to what would he have been to our family? I think that was what the question was, right?
Yeah, and I first let me just stop for a moment and say how strange that feels to me, having had a son, as you know, born with a disability, a rare metabolic disorder, that they would give you that information over the phone.
Yeah. And so just to go back into the factual part, they said to come to the children's hospital, but they didn't tell us anything. And was actually in the room. And you know how doctors are, they tend to
Right.
not be emotional. And it was like
Right.
boom, boom, boom. This is the situation. They showed us x-rays, and it was widespread downs. It told us all the ugly parts. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was quite horrible, especially because I didn't have any children,
Sure.
and my wife had two boys from her previous marriage, so it was all a new experience.
Well, and just let me add too that my experience of persons with Down syndrome, if they do survive, and many do, they're if we can be stereotypical for a moment, they are the most joyful.
Yeah.
They're just so fun to be around and the most joyful. And so I would add to the list of how you described him, and I'm sure you think of him this way, as a joyful being, a joyful spirit. But going back to kind of that assumption that I alluded to a moment ago, there is, and I think, and I want to hear your experience of this, an assumption in our culture that I hear a lot about, that when a child dies either before birth or early in the early years, that the loss is somehow different or less significant because maybe there aren't as many memories, or maybe just because other people in the family or the surrounding environment didn't get a chance to know that child. And I want to be careful not to impose that experience on you, but I wonder if you've ever encountered that kind of minimalization or misunderstanding around Tommy's actual death.
Well, it's interesting reflecting back because I've heard that through circles and conversations with others. Well, at least you didn't have to endure the pain of him going through this disability, or it can't be the same because he never really made it to pass the finish line. And my feeling is that there is no difference. To be honest with
Mm,
you, a year after we lost Tommy, the miracle of a daughter came, and so I have a child. So I know what it's like to have a child, Sharon, but it feels the same to me
hmm
because through the early parts, we I think my brain formed an emotional connection with him, uh,
hmm
and that stayed with me. And in terms of the layers of it, I went through different stages of the grieving. And when I first lost Tommy, I was a very busy CEO in my career, so I kept busy and didn't really
hmm
think too deeply of it. But as I came across people who had sons, particularly, I started listening to their stories of, on the weekends, what they would be doing with their kids, particularly the dads. And then the next layer came when my father and my mother, and expecting a grandchild. Uh, my dad passed away in 2018, but he never had a grandson. So I started thinking about all those things. What would it be like to not have, a son, and the loss that my dad might have experienced, not being
hmm
able to take him fishing. So all the things I grew up with that my dad was brought into my life, I was, unconsciously hoping that I would have that, in the life of my parents. But going back to, is it any different? I don't think it's different. Of course, I can't put myself in anyone's shoes, but I think the pain even today, thinking about it, is as difficult as it was 31 years ago. And
Yeah.
when I think about little Tommy, and I talk about him to people openly, I talk about him as if he was a living human being, right? He was here with us.
Well, and He is, if we look at it from, my work, which, as you well know, involves systems. When we talk about family systems, we
Yeah.
often talk about how important it is to name, the children in the proper order. I've seen great disruption in families when siblings don't know that they're not the second child, or they think they were the first child, and then later find out that there was a first child that was lost that no one talked about. They
Yeah.
they often will describe it as they never felt where they fit in the family. And when we do the systemic mapping work around that and they understand, or, often they didn't know about it till later in life, it has a tremendous effect on them to know that, yeah, I had an older brother or sister who was first. I know that's true for myself because my mother lost her first daughter
Yeah.
to SIDS disease, and I knew about it all my life. But because it was her first marriage and I'm in the second marriage, I always thought of myself as her first daughter. And when I
Yeah.
did the deeper work, realizing, no, I wasn't the first daughter, I'm really the second daughter, it changed my understanding because my mother was someone who was not available really.
Right. Yeah.
And I didn't really understand that because to me as a child, it felt very personal. But then, of course, later having lost a child myself and understanding that I was the second daughter somehow opened up a healing in me and gave me more compassion for what my mother must have gone through in losing that first baby.
Well, I want to just riff on that with you because a whole bunch of things come to mind. I tend to tell stories, but when you say something, it makes my mind go on these journeys. And I was thinking about the, when we lost Tommy and the memories of that and what it means to me today. What I don't talk about, and I'm going to talk about it here openly, is the shame that came with it. And
Mm,
in my own doctoral work, I did a doctorate degree and actually heading to London for graduation in about a week's time. I was born in London. I came to Canada here when I was 6 years old. So it's like a homecoming, a pilgrimage. But, this thing about shame, they say, or I learned that, when there's something that feels off, if you name it and you talk about it,
mhm,
that's the beginning pathway to healing. And I know that you're an expert in this area. I never talked about the loss of Tommy very much. In fact, some might say, wow, Tom, 30 years later, you're starting to
mhm,
talk about it. But I want to be true to the audience that this is the first interview I've done openly talking about it. And as a busy executive, I start realizing now that part of why I never talked about it in my circle is because of I believe, the shame of it. I felt like I let people down, or there was something wrong with me because I'd lost a child. Maybe there's something wrong with the way I create children, or maybe,
mhm,
I deserve this. And for quite many years, I came across people through my work, through their stories, who had lost children to cancer, for example, and and they talked about it openly. And I started wondering, why am I not talking about it? And then
mhm,
one of the things I came up with a bunch of different ideas. One of them was for fear of protecting my daughter. So a year later, I had a beautiful daughter. She's 28 years old now, just graduating university, just got married last year. She's the love of my life, next to my wife Anna. And I don't know how to say this, but I almost didn't want to talk about, oh my goodness, I missed little Tommy. I
mhm.
wish I had a son, because part of me felt that if I say that, it's going to diminish. She might think, well, dad wanted a boy. You know,
Right.
I'm a Canadian, but my roots are to India, where my great grandfather was born. My parents were born in Fiji, but there's this bit of thing in our culture about the boys are sort of the kings. And, back in that land, for whatever reason, I don't agree with it. Boys are desirable and women or girls maybe aren't the first choice. It's just a dumb belief system. And there's much to that. And so I went through this, and I still even prepared for this interview. I started thinking about, what if my daughter hears this interview and I have to be careful? I have to be guarded, because what if she hears it and says,
Yeah.
Dad, you're very disappointed because Tommy
Yeah.
didn't come and I'm really sorry I let you down. So that was the first thing, is about the shame. And how I think I overcome came that was really when I started doing podcasting. I had people coming through the show and talking about, I've probably had a dozen people who have lost children. And
Mm,
one of the biggest threads in some of the interviews is died by suicide. which is
Hmm.
just horrible, right? And I found myself when I started talking to other people, like with you here, I started seeing between the space between us, I started seeing in their story a part of me and a
Right.
part of me that was missing. So they're talking about openly about the loss of this child. And I'm starting to say, wait a minute, what they're saying and they're feeling and what they went through, that's kind of causing
Yeah.
me something in my gut. And I started then relating back in the conversation little bits, right? You know,
Right. Right.
I almost had a son, or his name would have been little Tommy, etc. And I remember now when I think about this, that each time I would do those interviews and say something back, it was like they're giving me permission to see myself in their story. I started feeling a bit better. And
Right.
when I said something to them, I didn't feel the shame. It actually felt freeing. It felt good. So so yeah, the shame piece. I think people, name the trauma, name the loss, talk about it,
Yeah.
find a way to approach it. But I think I'll close on this with that point that without doing this interview is part of that journey of healing. But without talking about it, uh, I don't think I would be whole as a person. And then the second side of that is talking about is not just about, oh, woe is me, the loss, but it's about all the positives because there are many
Right.
positive
There are many
experiences.
positives, right?
Oh my
I
God,
want, I want to,
we used to go to IKEA and shop for the big fancy buggy and all the fancy gear
yeah,
and some of those moments with my wife too, where we're telling stories to her tummy and things that just in the dream of having my first child. I mean, those are
yeah,
golden moments, but the trauma buries it all
it
unless
absolutely
you bring
does.
it out, right? You
Yeah.
reclaim it, I think, as you say.
And it takes some time, I think, too. But I know that you've talked about Tommy, beyond the loss. You really have in our conversations. And as someone whose absence continues to shape your life, your marriage, your family, and your understanding of identity. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, beyond what you've already said, maybe how he's still in relationship with you over time. Because I know
Sure.
that can seem odd in our culture. We sometimes want to, especially the people around us. I think
Yeah.
we've all experienced this where people want us to move on or get over it. I mean, there's a variety of ways that people want to see us healed and express that, and all well-meaning. Um, but what is that relationship now like for you?
Yeah, I just as you're talking, I wrote some notes. I'm a bit of a visual learner, so my brain started drawing pictures. First picture I experienced was if you go outside of my studio here. This is my
Mhm.
podcast studio into my living room. That way, we have a fireplace, and in front of the fireplace, there's a little figurine. What's about this big, and
Mhm.
uh, and in it is Tommy's hospital bracelet,
Oh,
picture of the ultrasound where his
yeah.
body. And we sealed all that up in a little tomb and we put it in front of our fireplace. So there's not a day that goes by where I don't sit and
Yeah.
embody that feeling that Tommy's right there. And how's he
Right.
with me? I mean, when I have sometimes good days, sometimes rough days, I'll find myself unconsciously looking at that
Yeah.
and having conversations with him. Another way he's with me is in in life experiences. For example, we're hosting World Cup soccer here in Vancouver, and
Mhm.
I'm not a big soccer player. I played for the North Delta Trojans when I was a kid, mostly influenced by my late father. But I remember just in my mind having an unconscious conversation and saying, "Hey, Tommy, check this out. Look at Messi scored 3 goals. How awesome is that?" And
Yeah.
just reliving experiences today as if he was here.
Yeah.
The last part of him being here would have is in the memories of my father who passed away in 2018. So there's a lot of life things that happen. For example, it's summer now, and we go up to the lake with our family, and I think about Tommy being with us. I
Right.
I have him. It's almost like he's here.
Do you have a visual of him? Because I would think that's one of the harder parts is that because he wasn't actually physically born. Like I have pictures of my son, not
Yeah,
everywhere, but in strategic places. I have, to your point of, I'm looking right out now on my yard, and I have a globe called the Tree of Life that someone made for us, and it's beautiful, and we hang it out, in the summertime.
Yeah.
And every time I go up the steps and make a right to my car, I look at that Tree of Life and I think of Michael. There's so many ways that when I think of him, though, I have a face, I have a body. Now I do have moments where I imagine him not in a wheelchair and in a whole body, and I imagine what would his physique have been like? Would he have been taller than my husband, huskier, those kind of moments? Do you have those kind of experiences, or, what comes up for you in your visual representation of him, particularly since you're a visual man?
Well, I can tell you now what's coming up. I don't have these visualizations as frequent, I guess. Uh, I have pictures from when I was a little boy myself, and there's one of me.
Mm.
It was taken back in Fiji, and I had a big head of curly hair. People used to say I was a sad baby because I'm serious. I don't smile, but I was sitting on these big cushions that my mom had, and I had this big smile on my face in that moment. That picture is what comes up when I think of Tommy, because they say that children, if you look closely at their features, there's mom and dad in there. So,
Yeah.
and selfishly, I like to think that little Tommy be like a mini me. So I
Yeah.
think that picture, I see, I see him as some smiling. I don't see him as somebody who's sad.
Hmm.
And and this is the hard part because I've never really thought of this, but why don't I see him as disabled? Right, he had Down syndrome. It was widely spread. It was really extreme. Why don't I see that? Am I masking that? Am I covering it up? Why is it? I'm not sure
Yeah.
on
But
that.
maybe because, I mean, I guess it depends on your background, but I like to think of my son as fully, to use the word, whole. I mean, I
Yeah,
do imagine him now a spirit who is able to walk and no more pain and suffering, kind of thing. Maybe that's why. I mean, maybe that's what the universe, God, Tommy would prefer, is that you imagine him, without the disability. And
yeah,
that's not to say, because I'm, obviously a advocate for the disabled and the spirit and the joy that they bring. I always say they bring us back to our humanity. So I'm not in any way trying to infer that there's something
sure.
wrong with the person who has a disability, but I think it comes with a lot of challenges that most of us don't have to endure. And I prefer to think that my son is free of all of that, free of the wheelchair, free of
Yeah. Well, I think that's where I think too. And with my dad passing away in 2018, I didn't know him most of my life. My dad left when I was 12. There's a whole other story there. He's quite an addicted alcoholic, and he was an army commanding officer. So I was raised kind of tough environment, but I started having all these thoughts too about some regret about not my dad, like when he died, my dad not having experiences to take little Tommy fishing or take little Tommy to kick a soccer ball around. And some of that came along
mhm,
with my dad passing. And never really thought about that until he left, that he didn't have a
mhm,
grandson. So yeah, I mean, I don't think trauma happens on a time scale. So it
right,
happens.
right.
I'm sure when I go to London for my graduation, I'll be sitting there and going like, damn, I wish he was sitting here right
Yeah,
beside me.
yeah,
Why taking a photograph of my iPhone
yeah,
perfectly as I told him to while I'm crossing the stage. But you just and now that you were talking about my daughter a bit, I kind of think what would have happened if I didn't have a child, if I didn't have my daughter. And there's another
yeah.
nuance that comes in that I raised two stepchildren. They're both boys. So the
Mhm.
two boys I raised were 9 and 12 when I met them. So it's like I had an experience with boys in my life, even though I'm the stepdad, I raised them. So there's some guilt around that. Is like, did they replace Tommy? And
Yeah,
then what would it have been like if Tommy was here in the mix with these two
yeah,
good-looking boys? And my wife's Italian, so now I start getting all excited when I'm talking to you because I never thought about that until now.
yeah.
That's like, man, it could have been like almost like the Brady Bunch, but you've got. I would see him as a leader in that group because the
Mhm.
boys had their. I know the boys' backgrounds. I won't talk about them for identity protection, but
Yeah,
I think Tommy'd be kicking their butts. Like
yeah,
they were
yeah.
always talking about being the best soccer players, and a very different thing too is I'm a very academic minded person. So, a little bit of me selfishly, but I know a lot of clients. Well, through my public practice, I do coaching, and I have one client that comes to mind right now who owns 20 companies or construction companies, and his son, he's in his 60s, his son's in his 30s, he's the heir
Hmm.
apparent. And all of that stuff too just plays
Right,
on my
right.
mind. It's that I have my own business, and if
Yeah.
Tommy was here, you know, I'd try to influence him to carry on my legacy, and so I think in some way we can do something with this loss in our work, right?
Well, how
Whether
I'm going to ask you how, because I know you and I talked about, and I just did a show on, what might have happened, and I talked about not necessarily dwelling in that, but knowing and just considering, because I think that's just a natural thing. I know my husband, plays golf, and most of the guys up here, when their sons, if they have sons, come in and they're out with their sons playing golf. So I know that a lot of what you're describing is true for him as well, of what could have been. But I know you've done a lot of work through your doctoral experience on identity, and I'm wondering, how has your understanding of yourself really changed because Tommy was and is still very much a part of your life? I mean, have you noticed that shift in identity? Because I know for me, I feel like everything I am, everything I've done in my career, everything I've accomplished is because of the experience of having a child with a disability. And then certainly, after Michael passing in 2008, the work I had to do just on my own spirit to get through it has impacted the work I do with clients in very dramatic ways. So, what is your understanding of yourself, and how has it changed because of Tommy?
yeah, I'm just writing a few things down here. Uh, that's a question that actually has deep meaning, and there's a nuanced answer all over the place in my head on this one. A bit emotional too. That I think if I hadn't had that experience of expecting a child, losing a child, then my passions or my purpose in the world might be very different.
Hmm.
So, for example, when you lose a child, it it wires in you. It makes me hypersensitive to other people who have lost children. So I find myself doing things unconsciously and consciously. And I probably didn't even think about this till now. That I'm going like, why am I doing that? So in terms of my identity, I'll give you some examples. I do podcasts and I get guests being sent to me as you do by booking agents. And now that I'm thinking about it, I get maybe a dozen profiles a month of people to
Right.
interview, and yet I get stuck on, in a good way, stuck on people who have a loss in their life of child, something to do with that thread. So there's
Hmm.
the first thing that shaped me is like I'm actually hovering to people who have had losses, and so
And
maybe
what is it that intrigues you about them? Because your show is focusing on leadership and aspects of
yeah
business. But what is it that you're hoping to? I mean,
yeah.
is there a gut instinct that says that they may have more of one thing versus another, or what is the draw there, or do you have awareness of that?
Well, I have awareness now since I did the doctorate. So in the doctorate, I started learning that part of what I was doing in my public work. So my background, as you'll put in the show notes, is I'm a CEO from
Hmm.
industry. So I was a hired executive most of my career. And then I created a platform to do coaching and teaching and podcasting and
Hmm.
books, those type of things. What I discovered through the doctorate, Sharon, is that because I was wondering, why am I doing all this stuff? And people would ask me, my CEO buddies and my exec friends would say, why don't you just go back and sit in a chair and be an executive? It's easier. And
Yeah.
I'm going like, I don't know why I'm doing all this stuff. But I learned through my doctorate why, because I was doing this dance. I was having relational dialogues with people in my podcast studio. I was, for example, when I wrote my first book, it was written as a fable, but as stories, and there were characters I was relating to in the book. And what I discovered is I was seeking something that was missing. So there were neural adaptations in my head. In other words, parts of me that were buried that I never talked about.
Hmm.
So I was searching for things that were missing in my identity, in my own story. For example, who was my grandfather? Why did my dad
Right.
leave home? Why did little Tommy die and other people don't have little Tommies who die? what was the meaning of all this? Why am I interested in interviewing Sharon, who's lost a child so much, versus this? And what it really was, as I discovered, is that I was seeking to learn about my own story, to fill in those gaps. And maybe if I interview Sharon, maybe something in that interview is going to help me with what's missing in my story. It identified that part of me
Right,
that's
right.
missing. So, for example, every time I did an interview of somebody who lost a child, for example, I did the Ride to Conquer Cancer, which is a 2-day bike ride. And it was for a gentleman I know who lost his daughter to leukemia at age 11. And I interviewed him, and I was really curious about what, like, some of the things were like, what was it like to live with a daughter who had leukemia? And in her story, the cancer
Hmm.
was there, then it went into remission, and then it came back. So this was like, how did you deal with that? How did you get
Right.
through it? What did you do? So in these interviews that I do of others, I'm hoping that people will find in their stories something missing that's going to lock something in their own stories. And that's going to lead them to living a fuller life. It's going to lead them to saying, I just heard what Roger was saying. And, he does this bike ride every year because it's part of how he gives back in honor of his daughter. So, maybe
Yeah.
I
So I
maybe
think
I should do that.
yeah, I think what I'm hearing in you, and as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking so much of that might be true for me. I'm often heard to say that, if it hadn't been for Michael having a disability and then all that we've been through, I, I shudder to think how shallow I might have been. Not that I don't have shallow moments. I think I do, but I'm saying he brought such meaning and purpose to our lives and still does. So I'm wondering, how, if at all, have you seen Tommy's presence, his life, short as it was, perhaps influence people around you or even through your work who've never actually met him?
Yeah. I'm just going to continue with the last story and then build on it with your question. So I talked about how how's it changed me. It's for example, through the podcast, I'm interested in interviewing people who have had loss, particularly of children. Uh, One of the things I started doing just a couple of years ago is I'm a faith-based guy, so I'm not talking religion here, but I believe
Mhm,
in God and I have a relationship there. And I started volunteering. Actually, I was sitting in an audience at a Christmas uh, Christmas event in my church with my wife, and a couple guys walked on stage and started talking about prison ministry. And my brain really got connected to that. I went, why am I connected to this? And so one thing led to another, and I decided to join the prison ministry in what's called the parental reading program. And so the parental reading program, I remember when I got interviewed to do it by the lead pastor of this ministry, they said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Well, my dad left home when I was 12, so I had a
mhm,
loss of a parent,
mhm.
and I lost my son as well earlier in my life. And I'm thinking about all the kids who have lost parents, or all the children out there, and doing something meaningful to give back to these children." And so we go into the prison and basically record the fathers who read books to their
Mhm.
children, and we take that and we send it over to the child. And I was
Well,
thinking, like,
that's
how,
beautiful. That's really beautiful.
so, well, I was thinking about how does that replace Tommy, or what am I doing today where
Mhm,
Tommy shows up? And here's an example. I'm sitting across from somebody. These men are in red jumpsuits. We're in a library in the maximum security prison. We get 15 minutes with each. And I'm sitting there watching these grown men who have made biggest mistakes in their lives reading books that they've chosen, children's books, while we record it, but reading to their children. And you're not allowed to humanize them. You're not allowed to make them weak, because if they go out into the cell block, they can get killed.
ah,
But I hold a space, same thing I
mhm,
was telling
mhm.
you, I hold this space for them to talk about things. And one of the fellows was reading his book and he started welling up. He started crying. Like, this is a grown man, right?
Right.
And we stopped and we paused. And I said, how you doing? Take a deep breath. Dad. And I said, what, are you okay? What happened? He said, my mom used to read me this book. My
Mm,
mom passed away, and my mom, I miss her. And I
mm.
remember in that moment, I said, I understand what it's like about children, about loss. I said, little Tommy's my son, and he left me. And so part of him's in this room. So after that, I'm reflecting now on it. Here I am sitting with a maximum security prison with an
Mm,
inmate, and we're talking about children, and I have a story I can tell about little
yeah.
Tommy Lawson.
And I feel
It,
like what I'm as I'm listening to you, I feel like the heart is opened for even this level of service, which is a big leap that I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know that you would have been, I'll use the word called to even do this as a big time, CEO, busy guy. But now here's Tommy. Your heart is open as a result of the experience of him that allows you to have more compassion and empathy for someone who's not even in your world. And there you are really ministering to someone in a way that is just so beautiful and so important. I mean, do you agree with that kind of summation that Tommy's opened your heart to be more available and compassionate to others?
yeah, that's where I was going with all of this. Is there's a part of my life now where I'm connected and doing things with a thread to children, right?
Hmm.
And I was always, as I grew up, because I was a lone wolf. Even though people who knew me said you're a busy executive, you're kind of a successful guy. I was kind of always keeping to myself, right? I
Hmm.
wasn't opening myself up. My heart was closed because of all these missing parts of it. And and Tommy actually did something miraculous in my life, is that he opened me up to doing things in a way like the prison ministry, like
Right.
talking to others who've lost children. And I think that's really a big part of the mission, is that, if I can say it this way, in my life, God put me in a situation where I lost my son, but maybe that was using me to say, Tom, you've got some gifts here, and you go out
Hmm.
now and do something with it to help others. And it's funny because there's a thing in the brain called the reticular activating system. And if you, for example, to describe to your audience, if you close your eyes and think about the color red, and you're in a stadium of people and you open, all of a sudden you see the color red, because this part of your brain filters out.
Right.
So it's interesting because since the loss of Tommy, I find that my brain sees uh, more children, more loss of
Yeah.
children, more
Yeah.
stories, and yet I don't think if that had happened, I would see that. I
Right.
would live. I
Right.
would live in a world where maybe just like most people, I focus on just life
Yeah.
and living children, but the focus on the losses.
I think what's so interesting because I see the point I want to make for anyone out there who might be in the early stages is, or for people that just, I think we've all had those moments where, someone in the external family and an aging aunt or someone, I've had things said like, well, now you can get on with your life, meaning, you had this burden of a child with a disability. And I remember thinking when that comment was made, what are you talking about? He is my life. But I think the point that you're making that is so important is that the relationship with our children continues and it continues to evolve, and that is perfectly normal and perfectly fine. And there's no timeline for how we should grieve. There's no beginning and end. It just becomes a part of us, and hopefully in a way that is manifested for the greater good in society. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how so many of my clients who are very successful people, and I know you work with the same types of individuals, but they experience what I often call the emptiness of success. And they come to me and I just am calling to mind someone I worked with last year who had really just an ideal life, a beautiful family, loving husband, but she was very, very depressed all the time and felt like life just wasn't what it could be. And then somehow in the course of our work together, of course, it always comes out, that I lost my son. And it changed everything for her. It changed her perspective on her own gifts and her own beauty and the marriage and the children that she has, because she couldn't imagine anything worse than losing a child. And it wasn't that I intentionally told the story to, like, say to her, look at how lucky you are. It just evolved naturally in our relationship. But I think as I listen to you, Tom, I'm realizing that there's such a deep purpose in our stories. And you talk about Tommy not being something in the past, that he is your story. And I think, however we choose to express that as a parent, and I don't want to suggest that parents need to be out there doing all these amazing things, because some parents, they just they don't feel equipped at maybe this point in time or ever to do some of the things that you and I do, and that's fine too. But I know that it gives me purpose to do the work that I do, and Michael is in the middle of my work all the time, and it sounds very real for you in that context as well. I want to ask you though, going back to the experience that you were talking about with the shame, did you ever feel that your experience as a father was understood differently than your wife's experience as a mother? Because I think as society, particularly in a prenatal loss, sometimes, we all feel the pain and suffering of that loss of the dream child, but we, I think, tend to focus more on the mother. I mean, did you feel that your experience was understood differently? How did it affect your sense of belonging, I guess, is what the deeper
Yeah,
question in that experience?
I laugh a bit uh, because guys, look, guys are. It's funny because I had a concussion in 2018, so they sent me because slipped into depression into rooms for mental health reasons. I had depression all, and I was in a group setting, and there were men and there were women, and the guys are sitting there like they're tough, right? They don't talk, they don't
Right.
complain, and they don't show their emotion or whatnot. And and I think maybe I'm wrong in this, but I think the conversation about who we focus on more because of the loss of a child being the woman is also self-imposed by the guys.
Mm,
If I'm out there talking about it more, showing my emotions, right? Showing my grief, uh, then I'm gonna get something back. But if I cover it up, if I don't talk about it because I'm supposed to be like, suck it up, Tommy, be tough, then maybe I'm not going to welcome that
right.
empathy. I'm not going to welcome that concern. But going back to what you said, I do a lot of reading and research, and I'm not going to cite anything here because I need facts. But biologically, I think it's true. I think the impact on a woman who's reared the child, right, who's gone through that is completely different. We can't compare it. But I think the life impact is is somewhat equal in terms of mom and dad losing a child because the thing we don't haven't talked about in this interview yet, I want to talk about, which is becoming alongside the mother. Like
Hmm.
how do you when the mom loses a child, how do you come alongside her?
Yeah.
What does the man do? Do we go back to work and just don't talk? Don't and I think that, we saw more outpouring and more concern, I think, for mom than we did for me. And when I step back and I look at that, I think, well, why is that? And I really believe that it might be just built into the human condition of, we don't mention or we don't talk to Tom about it. You know,
Do
we,
you think that it's because of it was perinatal? Like, because I know in our situation, my son was 27,
yeah,
and the world around us knew how close that relationship was between my husband and Michael. So it to me, it felt, and he may feel differently, but I don't think so. I think it felt pretty equal. The guys really, I mean, everyone in general, I think, understood that this was a dramatic loss for both of us because they had witnessed us as a family. Again, going back to our beginning conversation where people didn't witness you together, it seems like we think of the loss maybe more for the mother than the father because she carried this child for, X amount of weeks, months, whatever. Do you think that's part of it?
yeah, I think it is. And then now that you said that, it actually brings up some other things that are hard to deal with. That it's true. Everything I'm talking about here about Tommy is some people might say you're just making it up. How can you say that? He was never beside you. He was never in a boat with a fishing rod. He was never,
Hmm.
sitting with you and mom, at his school, whatever. And I don't know how to answer that. That creates a bit of shame, to be honest with you, not on purpose, but it's like it's a competition. It's like, well, you had I had my children, they were at least there. I had that chance. And I, I can't really explain if others would judge me differently because he wasn't, you know, he wasn't with us.
Well, so
And
much of this show, I've really stated from the very beginning, I don't want there to be a hierarchy in the loss because I know
Yeah.
there is even amongst parents if your child died of drug overdose or suicide or even as we've been talking perinatal because a loss of a child is it's all relative to that family. So that's one thing that I'm really trying to bust up. But then the other thing is regardless of how long you had him or the fact that you didn't have a physical presence of him, you have so beautifully stated how he was very much a part of the future that you and your wife imagined. And you've talked a lot about and really helped me see that a big part of that pain and really the suffering around the loss is the fact that so much didn't get to happen, like
Yeah.
your father
Yeah.
experiencing him and whatnot. So I think there's a tendency for us as parents, though I know I do it myself, is to compare our loss with someone else. Like I have a friend that I've talked about a lot who lost her daughter a couple years ago to a horrific accident. Beautiful young girl, 26, just starting to think about marriage and building her career. And I often think about their loss is greater than mine because, my son was ill and there was never going to be a marriage or grandchildren or any of those things. But then that diminishes my own loss. So when I catch myself going to that and saying, feeling so much for her and diminishing my own loss, I have to pull back and say, no, part of my integration, as I often talk about, is knowing that my loss, your loss is as real, your child as important and meaningful. And there's a reason that this person, uh, their spirit still lives on, and there's something to consider in all of that. Whatever we do with it, whatever meaning we assign to it, is up to us as family members. I'm wondering what you think when I talk. I just briefly touched on what I think integration means. What does it feel like or mean to you uh, in today's world when so much of what you've talked about is unresolved? What does feel steady and integrated into your life in the here and now, if anything? But I think there's quite a lot.
Well, I think one of the things I wrote it down here a bit ago was I lost a son, but I gained my soul. And I think this is really important because when we talk about the integration of this loss of Tommy into my life today, it, it it makes me feel whole to have had a son, even though I didn't have a son. I don't know if anybody can make sense of that. I can. And yeah, when sorry.
It's all right. Take a moment.
Yeah, it's like if my friends will pull out their pictures of their kids, right? Or you had a
Mhm.
son and yeah, you lost him maybe at age 5 or 6, but then you'll say, here, look at this picture.
Right.
And I can't show that picture.
Yeah.
And so the pictures are imaginary. So I look at all that, but I want to go back for a minute to something that I've been doing to deal with this personally. I point back in my studio, there's a replica of a human brain there. And I studied a lot of neuroscience, and the way I understand my brain works is it's a thought machine, right? So it creates thoughts, it embodies emotions, which are feelings and sensations, and then that basically creates a behavior. So I think there's two things. I can have the meaning of the loss of Tommy as a negative thought, a really sad thing, or I can talk about it, accept it, and then turn it into something positive. What has it done for me? And
Hmm.
when we have positive thinking, it ends better because then you can create outcomes or behaviors. You actually do things in life.
Right.
You integrate into your life the loss of a son, but you can make a choice. The brain can choose to think positively about it, which then has me go out into society and live and enrich other people's lives. And so I think that's the journey I've made. And I didn't quite understand that until this stage in my life where I started going out and doing things with that story that were positive. And I think that really has made my life, it's enriched my life, it's made it better. But I do know a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, but I know many people who they can't get past the loss.
Right.
They haven't grieved. And one thing I would reach out to the audience to say is, you need somebody in the room if you can't get through it, you have to reach out to a professional, a counselor, or psychology, somebody who can hold the space for you to be able to. Let me just put it this way. I read this in my thesis research. Carl Rogers, who really established psychotherapy, he taught me that there's certain conditions of relationship that have to exist between two people for you to feel seen and heard, right? And then to
Hmm.
grow as a human being. So one is deep listening, empathy, accepting me with unconditional positive regard, and um, and then maybe a bit of sharing back something that makes you relatable, so that oxytocin, that joy, starts coming into my brain. There are a lot of people, and I don't put people down for this because I'm one of them, who don't know what to say when somebody says, I
Right.
lost my son. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry, but at least you didn't have to live 10 years with him and experience and have to deal with that. At least you lost him before he was born. At least this. And they say stupid
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
because they don't know.
They don't know what to say. Yeah.
Now, when you go into psychotherapy, which I went through for my depression, other things happen. So the unintended consequence of
Hmm.
my own therapy for depression, which I work through well, is I started talking about deeper things that were hidden, like
Hmm.
the loss of my son. Like when I had my concussion, part of what when I was in therapy, I would talk about, I wish he was here. I wish he was here to do this. I really miss him, or I feel sad, but sometimes I think about this and why did God do this and take my concussion, have me stop life for a few years. And now, why did that happen with my son? All this stuff. And I started processing it. And when somebody listened to me and I felt seen and heard, everything just changed. And I know I went on a tangent there for a reason, but I think this part about meaning and changing it to something that's positive can happen. But you need to redo it with, you need to be in a relationship with somebody else to move through it,
Right. Right.
whether it's talking to somebody who's lost a child. But I really believe in having somebody who's professionally trained, who knows how to have the conversation with you so you can be seen and heard. I think that's
Yeah.
really, really
It's
vitally.
really important. And
Yeah,
I know certainly in generations past, and I still see some of it today where people just think they can soldier up and push through. But as we know,
you
trauma
can't.
stays in the body and
Yeah.
it can manifest in other ways. So it's important to help others, or to have someone, as you mentioned, outside. As we reach the top of the hour, I want to be conscious of your time, and I want to thank you for being so candid and vulnerable and open,
Welcome.
Tom, in expressing what this journey has been like for you. And I feel like uh, today, Tommy's in the middle of this conversation, and he's just a big part of what we're hoping to bring to other parents and people around those parents who are trying to move through this journey of loss. And I think you've touched on this, but I want to end with one final question because, again, we have very clearly stated that this show is really positioned and intended for parents who are in that what I call the long after. They've been through the years of the loss and have had to deal with the identity issues and all the things that we've kind of touched on briefly today. But I also know that those that are in the early stages, what I said in my first podcast is you deserve more than a podcast. So please seek additional supports. But I'm hoping they're listening and they can learn from those of us that are in that long after season. So if a parent listening today is in those early stages of losing a child and really can't imagine they're ever, I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe, and maybe someone is in that place where they can't imagine carrying this loss for decades to come, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that it's okay to say that you're not okay, and you'll get you'll get to the other side of this, but it never goes away.
Right.
And talk it out. Talk
Mhm.
about it, whether it's through relationships with others who have experienced the same thing, or whether it's through reaching out your benefits plan at work or whatever it is, to sit down in a room with somebody and say, I just need to talk this out. And I promise you that when you start doing that, you will find thoughts will come into your mind that you buried, thoughts of joy, thoughts of happiness, And then it's incredible, but that creates this completely different behavior where you can go out and live life fullest. You can even smile and talk about the loss of little Tommy or little Jane to others, and people go, "Are you nuts? You're smiling, you're happy." It's
Yeah.
like, no, he's the biggest blessing and gift of my life.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a story, by the way. I'm a home chef and a cook, and I envision right now Tommy's in the kitchen and we're making pancakes and waffles, and he's got batter all over his face, and he's giggling and laughing, and I'm putting batter in his hair, and we're having this batter fight. We're having the time of our life. And as I'm talking to you now, look at my face, the inflection and the smiles. That's where I've come in my life, everybody. Where
Hmm.
today I talk seriously, but honestly, when people ask me about little Tommy, I can say with a smile on my face and talk about it. And I couldn't do that when I buried it.
Yeah. And it's perfectly fine that you can do that. And there's no shame or guilt or need to explain it away. It's your experience and your relationship with him that really matters. Thank you, Dr. Tom Dutta, for just being who you are and for the work that you're about and for the difference that you're making in other people's lives as a result of Tommy and just everything that you've been through. I'm so grateful to know you.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor. Appreciate it.
So, listeners, I hope that this will give some of you some insight, some other ways to think about loss. And perhaps if you're someone on the external aspects, because that's another piece that we're going to get into in this show, to really maybe hopefully have learned a way to be present with any parents out there or someone in your life who may have lost a child. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this conversation stirred something for you, you don't need to make sense of it right away. There's no timeline for understanding and no right way to carry what remains. Beyond the Loss exists to honor parents who've lost a son or daughter and all the complexity that this implies, and to support the professionals who walk alongside them without comparison, judgment, or explanation. Wherever you are in the long after, you are not required to arrive anywhere else. Until next time, take gentle care.